For a problem that's as dangerous and life-threatening as climate change, why aren't we required to study about it? Why doesn't the media go beyond reporting the new highest average temperature records? And why don't we have age-appropriate content for such a depressing discussion? These are the questions that I try to answer as a climate change communicator. My name is Ameera Adil. I'm 24 years old, and I've been a climate activist for the past 7 years. And the question that I get asked the most is, how did I end up here? How did I end up calling myself a climate activist? In 2014, I had to decide what I wanted to do for my bachelor's. We took a family trip to Naran and Lake Saif al-Muluk, and there I saw the lake trashed by tourists. I was infuriated, and I tried to pick up as much litter as I could and throw it into a nearby dustbin. And when I was done huffing and puffing about the ignorance of people, my mother suggested that I pursue environmental sciences. And that's where my journey started. Initially, I started calling myself an environmentalist, and I thought that individual behavior was the most important thing that we needed to change in order to fix climate change or environmental pollution. I thought if I use a plastic straw every day, billions of other people might be using the same amount of plastic straws every day. And so I stopped using plastic straws, and I tried to convince the people around me to do the same. I learned how much waste an individual produces in a year, and I went zero waste. I learned that having a plant-based diet is one of the best things you can do to lower your carbon footprint. And I went vegan and nearly starved myself. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't make a dent in climate change or environmental pollution. Because to make that dent, I would have needed to convince billions of people to give up things that made their lives easier. And so I decided to shift gears. I thought maybe individual action isn't going to be enough on its own, and maybe we need systemic change. So when I shifted gears, I learned about subsidies. I learned that fossil fuels received $5.9 trillion worth of subsidies in 2020, which basically means that in 2020, we spent $5.9 trillion making fossil fuels cheaper for consumption. And that's understandable because look what happened when Pakistan had to remove those subsidies. Energy prices went up, affordability decreased, and people's quality of life decreased. So we need energy. But the funny thing is that solar energy has been the cheapest form of energy since 2017. And any new solar and wind projects that were built in 2020 will be producing cheaper electricity than any new coal power plant in the world. Now, if we talk about plastic waste, which essentially comes from fossil fuels because plastics are made from fossil fuels, a handful of companies are responsible for most of the plastic waste that we have in our world today. Much like only 4 companies are responsible for 10% of global carbon emissions since 1965. And one of those companies is called British Petroleum, or BP. Now, British Petroleum came up with the term carbon footprint. It was at this moment that I realized that my concern about my consumption as an individual was pushed onto me as a part of a larger agenda to push responsibilities from producers to consumers. I was never the problem. The thing is that back when I started teaching myself about climate change or environmental pollution, I had no idea what I was doing. Whatever I found on the internet, I tried to adopt that, I tried to do that, and that was my main problem. I learned everything from random internet sources. So a phenomenon that affects potentially every person on this planet should not be delivered as, clickbait posts, 10 things you can do to solve the climate crisis, or 10 things you can do to lower your carbon footprint. And it shouldn't be delivered as a series of alarming headlines that instead of spurring you into action, they make you want to unfollow climate news. It needs to be taught, just like maths or history or English. And it doesn't even have to be a separate subject. It can be incorporated into virtually any subject possible. For example, in maths, you can learn how to calculate carbon emissions. In English, you can learn how someone's life is affected by climate change through a story. And in history, you can learn how one of the biggest fossil fuel companies in the world knew about climate change since the 1950s and gaslit the rest of the world into believing that the science was debatable. Similarly, if there are any economics students here, do you not need to learn about emissions trading or how climate change affects the economy? And if there are any biosciences students here, do you not need to learn about how climate change affects human health? Every academic field has its own contribution to give, and the options are endless. Incorporating climate change into existing academic fields will sensitize an entire generation into learning the basics of climate change, so that when we are presented with the opportunity to make climate-conscious decisions throughout our lives, we recognize those opportunities. In late 2021, the British Council did a study on the perceptions of climate change in Pakistani youth. They found that 70% of respondents said that climate change was the biggest upcoming threat to Pakistan. 70% also said that they were eager to learn more about climate change. And 80% said that gaining knowledge and informing others is a public responsibility. This is proof that basic awareness exists and that people want to make climate-conscious decisions. They just don't know how to recognize the opportunities to do so. And it's hard to contextualize climate action when there's such an amalgam of random information present in front of you. Climate change is not communicated in a way that translates into action for every audience. And we didn't have the privilege to learn about it in school. So what can we be doing differently now to ensure that we and future generations are empowered with the knowledge needed to fight climate change? So number one, as the climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe said, best thing you can do to fight climate change is to talk about it. Because when you talk about it in your own words and you share ideas through conversation, you are essentially creating a space to understand what climate action means to you, because it means something different to each of us. For example, if someone's living in North Pakistan in Gilgit, climate action for them might mean having early warning systems to prevent losses from glacial lake outburst floods. And for someone who's living in Karachi in the south, climate action might mean planting or conserving mangrove forests to store carbon or to prevent soil erosion. So it means something different to each of us. Number two, view climate change from your own perspective. I had a group of medical students come up to me recently, and they were telling me about these awareness sessions that they were doing on climate change in their communities. And I said, that's great, but why not focus on health instead? If you're studying to become health professionals, does it not make more sense to focus on your subject and bring an additional climate-related aspect into it and talk about climate change and health? We don't all need to be climate scientists. We can do what we're already doing and bring an additional climate-related aspect into our work, unless you work in the fossil fuel industries. Number three, know that you're not alone. Young activists often feel burnt out or overwhelmed by the amount of information that's present on climate change today. But you can contribute to climate change without burning out. There's a global community full of resources and people that's ready to help you. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for older activists who guided me and supported me whenever I needed it. So we all need to help each other. Much like the 14,605 futures that Dr. Strange saw at the end of Avengers Infinity War, we have a bunch of possible futures for us right now. And they were presented by the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The bad news is that none of these futures contains a world without climate change. The only difference between each of them is how tolerable it will be. Climate change is not a singular event. and it's not something that is going to happen. It is already happening. A heat wave that would have happened once a decade in the 1900s is now 300% more likely to happen with our current level of warming, which is 1 degree Celsius. And if we do our best and try to limit warming to under 2 degrees of Celsius, we're still going to see a rise by 560% in the likelihood of that heat wave, 5.6 times. And if we continue on our current trajectory, our current pledges, and our current level of action, we are seeing 4 degrees of warming. And the likelihood of that same heat wave increases by 1,000%. So we'll be lucky to get a single year every decade without a heat wave. And the same goes for extreme rainfall, floods, droughts, climate-induced migration, food insecurity, water availability, you name it. And as the British historian C. Northcote Parkinson said, delay is the deadliest form of denial. What future we end up with depends on us and how fast we act. But in order to act, we need to know what to do and how to do it. So talk about it, view it from your own perspective, and seek help and help others. Pakistan and other developing countries like us have this unique time-bound opportunity right now to not only industrialize sustainably, but also become regional and global leaders in climate action. So the answer to how did I end up here is confusion, miscommunication, and a whole lot of anxiety. I'm going to leave you with a quote from Michael E. Mann, who is one of the greatest climate scientists of our time. And it's a quote that I can never get out of my head. He says, "The surest way to lose a war is to refuse to recognize that you're in one in the first place." We have to fight for our future. There's no alternative. But it doesn't have to be a burden if we all do what we're already doing and learn how we connect to climate action. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.